Hello, I'm Trisha G. I'm a developer advocate at JetBrains. I'm hosting this webinar for Marcus, who's going to talk to us about productive web development in Java with IntelliJ, Spring Boot, and Vaadin. This is a great combination of keywords, which I think a lot of people are kind of interested in finding out how all of these things work together. So without further ado, let me switch you over to Marcus.
Can you see my screen fine?
Yes.
All right, let me just clean up all of these good webinar things. All right, so yeah, super happy that we could get this webinar going. I reached out to Trisha a while back saying that I've been doing these Vaadin demos for quite a while, and like, I don't know, a good portion of the questions I tend to get after a live coding demo is like, what was that keyboard combination you just did? Or what was that IntelliJ feature that you just did there? Like, how did you do all of this? And I figured it'd be fun to do a joint webinar where we can spend a little bit more time also on the kind of productivity things that you can do within the IDE to just make that development experience a little bit more fun and productive. Now, like Trisha said, maybe she didn't. I work as the head of the community team over at Vaadin. Vaadin is a full stack web framework for the Java platform, and it's an open source framework. And one of the kind of unique things about it is that it will allow you to build a full stack modern web application fully in Java. We're obviously going to use IntelliJ as well. I have the Ultimate Edition, but I believe most of the things, pretty much all of the things that I have here showing you will be things that work in the Community Edition as well. And finally, we're going to use a Spring Boot based starter so that we're going to kind of see how Spring Boot and Vaadin together make for a really, really kind of fast and productive way of building web apps. And the reason I like this combination is that both of them are easy enough to get started with, but they're robust enough that you can go into production with them feeling confident that you have a really solid application. Now, I don't have any slides for this. I'm going to spend all of the time coding. And if you have any questions, like Trisha said, add them to the questions panel, and she'll either ask them from me kind of as we're going along or at the end. So without further ado, let's get going. We're on the Vaadin website here, and we're going to go ahead and click Get Started here. And we are going to choose a Spring Boot based starter. We give this a name, call mine to do, a little hint towards what we might be building here. I'll open this, so I've unzipped it. And one of the ways that I like to open up a project is just taking the POM XML, dragging it on top of the IntelliJ icon, and have it open up. Now, if we go in and look at what we have here, you'll see that we have a Spring Boot application that loads a Vaadin BOM and a couple of other dependencies. What I'm going to build here is a full stack to-do application, meaning that we'll have a database where we persist the to-dos and kind of everything in between. So we need to add a couple of dependencies. Now, this is one of the features that I actually found this pretty recently, but I find this incredibly helpful. So you can start writing in here, Spring Boot, and I don't remember the exact name, something Spring Boot JPA. And you can see it suggests that I get this Spring Boot starter data JPA, and that's exactly what I want. So pulls in the right dependency. Since we are using the Spring Boot parent, we don't want to have the version number here because that will pull in the right version of each dependency. So we have Spring Data for managing the kind of data transactions, and then we have H2, which is a in-memory database. Vaadin isn't tied to any specific database, but H2 makes things really easy for us to get started here. Once we've added those, we need to make sure that we actually pull in those changes. And here's maybe a question for Trisha. Like, up until the very most recent IntelliJ version, I had the option of turning on automatic reloading for any changes to the POM file, but that seems to have gone away and been replaced by this little popover here. Is that something that I've configured differently in my IntelliJ, or was that a change that was introduced recently?
This is a change that's introduced recently. Which was, are you using 2020.2, the EAP? I didn't check one.
No, I have the 20.1, I think.
0.1. Yeah, I think it came in either in 0.1 or 0.2. I'm using the EAP, so I can never quite remember. And yes, so originally you could say turn it on so it automatically updates, or now you have this new way of doing things.
Okay.
Yes, there are mixed feelings about the way of doing that. I think there is a way to set the settings so you can also turn on the automatic update, but it's been pushed away, I think.
Yeah, not a big deal. I just sometimes I'm like unsure. Like I tend to be one of the people who goes in and changes all kinds of settings, and then I'm unsure if it was something I did or something that actually changed externally. Anyway, let's take a quick look at what we have in the project just to kind of get a lay of the land. So we have a Spring Boot application class here that starts up the Spring Boot application, and then we have two files that Vaadin generated for us when we got the starter. I'm going to delete these so we can start from a completely empty slate and just understand every single line of code that's in our project here. Let me just rearrange my windows just a tad so I can get some more space, and then create a new class. I'm going to call this a to-do view. Vaadin is a component-based framework, which means that everything that we work with is a component, and each component is represented by a Java object. So if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you'll feel very much at home with this model. So in order to create a view, for instance, we can extend from an existing component. I will extend from a vertical layout, and then in order for that to show up, we can map it to a route. So in this case, mapping it to an empty route will map it to the context root of the application. Then I'll generate a constructor, and in here we can add components into this vertical layout that is our view. Just to make sure that everything works, I'll add a h1 with the classic hello world and use the complete statement shortcut. So shift command return. That's something I like to use, kind of takes care of adding the semicolon and everything else there. Saves a little bit of typing, but that adds up over time. So let's go ahead and run the application, make sure everything works the way we want it to. So IntelliJ already picked up that this Spring Boot application configured the run configuration, and we can just go ahead and hit run here. While that's starting up, I want to show you one thing that I found very kind of helpful when working specifically with Vaadin applications, and that's if you go into the preferences panel and search for imports here. What I want to make sure is I have the unambiguous imports enabled and also optimize on the fly. Now for the unambiguous imports to actually be helpful in a Vaadin project, I found that I want to disable AWT and swing specifically, and some JavaFX packages. The reason being that they share a lot of the same class names like button and text field. And if there are three of them on the class path, of course, the unambiguous import will pretty much never work. Instead, you always have to kind of choose one of three similarly named classes. So this will help you avoid accidentally pulling in the wrong package or doing anything like that. All right, so let's see here. We have the application hopefully up and running. So we'll go to localhost 8080. Oh, actually no. So apparently when I open up the preferences panel, it started. All right, let's wait for it to go up. All right, so we have the hello world visible here, and we have a kind of base that we can start working on. Now, the first thing I want to do in our application is take care of the backend. So let's configure the persistence layer, the JPA entity that we are going to save, and then a repository that we can use to access the database to save things to it. So we'll start with creating a class called to-do, which will represent a single to-do item on our to-do list. This is a plain Java object, and I'll add a couple of fields to it. So we'll have a long for an ID. We'll have a string for the task that we're doing, and then finally we'll have a Boolean for the done state. I can mark these as private. Here, what I did is I hold down Option or Alt, I think, on Windows and Linux to select or add multiple cursors. That way I can add private to all of the lines at the same time.
This is one of my favorite tricks. I like that trick.
Yes, exactly. And yeah, that just sometimes it saves it. Do you remember what the shortcut is for adding kind of, oh yeah, that it's Shift and Option for adding cursors in just random places. That's sometimes pretty useful if you don't have everything lined up as well. All right, so we have the fields here, and what I want to do is again generate a constructor, one for that takes in a task. So that's just going to be a convenience constructor. And then because this is going to be a JPA entity, we need to have a no arguments constructor that it can use. And finally, we need getters and setters. All of these, I'm using the Command N generate window for that. So select all of those, hit return, and add those. Now, in order for this to get picked up as an entity, we need to annotate it. And this is, again, something that I hadn't seen before, but this is super helpful. So it tells me that there should be a primary key. And even though I had the idea that I need a key, I actually forgot to mention or mark it as a key. And while we're at it, we can define how this ID should get generated by passing in a strategy. So I guess this is redundant since auto is what it defaults to, but in this case, it's kind of good to be clear. So we have a object now that a JPA entity that we can save to a database. But in order to do that, we need a repository. So this is a Spring Data concept to do repo. I've stopped trying to type repository. That's very difficult to do live. And this will be an interface. And this is one of the kind of magic things in Spring Data if you haven't used it before. So you have an interface, you extend from another interface, JPA repository. And if we look at what this takes in as parameters, Command P, we can see it takes in two type parameters. The first one being the object that we're working with, and the other one being the type of the primary key. In our case, that was a long. And that's all we need to do with that to get all the basic CRUD operations. So we can save and delete and find and do all kinds of database operations without actually having to go in and write all the SQL to make that happen. So that is super convenient in my opinion. Now, going back to our view here, one of the nice things with a Vaadin application in a Spring container is that each view here is a Spring managed bean, which means that we can have access to our Spring backend right here. So we can auto wire in the repository, call it repo. Then I use the Alt Enter. I don't remember what the actual name for this is, but use that to generate a field based on this. So we'll save the repo into a field so we have access to it later on. And before you would have needed to add the auto wired annotation here, but that's been optional for a while already. I tend to leave it off just because I'm lazy. So if you haven't seen this before, that's what's happening. Spring will inject this repo instance in here, and it will actually generate a actual instance based on the interface that we created here. All right, so now that we have the backend, the plumbing done here, let's get to the actual UI here. So what we want in terms of the UI, we want a input field where people can type in the task that they're going to do, a button for adding them, and then a area where we can add all the to-do items that we have. So let's go ahead and replicate that. So we'll create a new text field. And the way I like to create fields and basically anything in Java is I type in whatever I want. I use the autocomplete, and then I use the extract or introduce variable shortcut here. So I'll call this task field. So that saves me from having to type most of this, and just for me at least, that makes things easier. So we'll have a button, add, again, complete statement, extract, add button, and then finally we'll have another vertical layout that we'll use to collect all the to-do items that we have. So we'll call this to-dos list like this. So what you can see here is that there's a pretty kind of common sense naming structure to Vaadin component. So if you want a text field, it will be called a text field. If you want a button, it's a button. And you just instantiate new objects to create them. So I will actually move these out of the constructor to fields and actually hide the sidebar here, Command 1, right? Yep. And then format the code to make things look nice. So we have the fields defined and we have the repository here. So let's go ahead and define the UI structure. We'll first of all add a header here so people know what app they're using. So we'll call something like important stuff, and then we can add the components that we have here. Now, we're inside of a vertical layout here, so it means that any components we add here will all get placed underneath each other. But what I want to do is have the field and the button next to each other. So the way I can accomplish that is by adding a horizontal layout for those. So we'll add a task field and the button, and finally the to-dos list. So you can see the structure here. We have a H1, we have the field and the button next to each other, and underneath those we have the list. I'll go ahead and build the application here. And one of the cool things with Spring Boot DevTools is that it comes with support for a all right, let's see, what did I do? Stop and rerun. So while that's starting up, one of the things that Spring Boot DevTools comes with is a support for live reload, which is a browser plugin that you can add to Chrome or Safari or Firefox or whatever browser you like to use. And once you enable that, whenever you build the project, it will automatically refresh the browser when you're doing things. I've noticed that when you add or change the repository or kind of backend stuff, you sometimes need to reload the full application for that to work. So you can see we have the basic structure in place now. So we have the H1 here, we have the text field, we have the button, and presumably we have the list underneath here. What's kind of interesting to see here is that we haven't written any HTML. Of course, we've been able to kind of express ourselves fully in Java here, yet we're getting things here in the browser. Now, the next thing I want to do is create a new component that we can use to express a single to-do item. And this component should have a checkbox that can mark the done state, and then another text field where we can go in and edit that actual task. So if we typoed or if we changed our mind on what that task should be, we can go ahead and do that. And it's a very common pattern when you're working with Vaadin or really any component-based framework, is that you build these custom compositions of components that are more specific to your application, so that you can have a more meaningful language, I guess, to express yourself instead of having to work with these low-level generic components. I'm going to inline this new class inside the same file just so we have everything in one file. Normally, if this was a kind of real-life application, I would split this into a separate file just to keep things a little bit cleaner. But for now, this is good. So So we'll call this to-do layout, and we'll extend again from a component. This time I'm going to extend from a horizontal layout. I'm going to generate a constructor again, and this will take in a to-do. So we have one to-do layout for one to-do. And here, like I said, we have a checkbox. We'll call this done. Then we'll have a text field, which we'll call task, and you'll see why in just a moment. Again, I'll move these up here. If you wonder why I keep doing this, is that the extract variable kind of hack or workaround or whatever you want to call it that I like to do in order to avoid typing this doesn't work when you're out here kind of in the field space, but it works inside here. So that's just what I've ended up doing. It's more of a preference thing. So I get the to-do in here. I've created the components, and I'll start by adding them. I think one of the most common things that mistakes people, including me, do working with Vaadin is that they create the components, but then they forget to add them to a layout, which actually makes them visible. So when you're working with Vaadin and you wonder why something doesn't show up, it's most likely because you forgot to kind of specify where you wanted to add it. Now that we have the actual UI components, we want to have a way to bind the data that we have in the to-do to these UI fields. The way we do that in Vaadin is through something called a binder. A binder binds a model to UI fields. So we pass in the type of the thing that we're going to bind and its class. We'll call this binder. Then we're going to call binder dot bind instance field on this. So what this means is that this, meaning this layout, we're going to bind the fields on it. So we have the fields done and task, and going into to do, you can see that we have fields with the exact same names here. So we have done and task here as well. And by doing that, we'll bind these UI fields to the data fields on this to do object. And then finally, we'll call binder.setBean with the to do that we got passed in here to make that bound. One thing I forgot to do up here is set the default vertical alignment to center. I like to keep things looking nice, so aligning things is one of the kind of easy ways to make an application look really professional, having everything like really nicely aligned and spaced and stuff, not a little bit wonky. So aligning things. And then finally, now we have a way of binding data from these fields to the object, but the final part here is actually saving those changes to the database. So for simplicity's sake here, I'm going to add a listener on the binder. So whenever either of those values changes, what I want to do is get the repo. So that's the JPA repository that we created, and call save on binder.getBean. So we get the updated object and we call save on it. Now this means that it will get saved to the database on every single time you change something. And for a small to-do application like this, that's fine. There's no need for us to kind of batch that up any more than that. So now that we have our new custom component called a to-do layout, we can actually go ahead and implement the logic of adding new to-dos. So essentially what we want to do when we click on the add button here, we want to see what the task is, create a new to-do object based on that, persist it to the database, and then show one to-do layout per to-do in our database down here. To do that, we're going to get a hold of our add button and add a click listener on it. So the way we add interaction to a Vaadin application is to listen to events that different components emit. So any component that a user can interact with in any way will have different events that they emit when those actions happen, so that we can react to them in whatever way we want to. Now, in this case, what we want to do is we want to take the repo and call save with a new to-do. And we get the task again from the task fields that we call get value. That will give us the text value from that text field. Then I'm going to take the task field, I'm going to clear it, I'm going to focus it so that we can easily add a new task without having to like manually go in and clear out the field. And finally, we're going to create a new method that refreshes the to-dos that are here. So essentially creates a to-do layout for each to-do that we have. The way I like to go about this is I like to call methods as if they exist. So I'll call refresh to-dos like this. It's going to show up as red now because it doesn't exist. Then I use option enter and create the method. Again, saves me from having to type a couple of characters, but over a day's worth of coding, all of this starts adding up and saving a lot of time. When we refresh the to-dos, I want to do two things. So I'll take the to-dos list, which is this layout, empty vertical layout that we have, and I'll remove anything that we had there from before. So every time we make a change, I'll just kind of reset it in order to kind of make this easy to follow along. Then we'll take our repository. So we'll go to the database, call find all to find all the to-dos that we have in our database. We'll stream them, and then we'll map. And I'll go through this in just a second, what each step does, but I'll map these to to-do layouts. So we'll create a new to-do layout for each. And then for each of those to-do layouts, we'll call to-do list dot add. And this is something I really like in IntelliJ, especially when I'm looking at code that I've written a while ago, or I'm looking at somebody else's code, is kind of seeing what the result of each step of a chained operation like this is. So we start out with a list of to-dos. We call stream, so we get a stream of to-dos. Then we do a map operation, which means that we now have a stream of to-do layouts. And then we take each to-do layout and pass that to the add method on the to-do list. So it makes it a little easier to understand kind of what's going on, even if it's been a couple of weeks since you wrote something or you're looking at somebody else's code. So if you look at the code right now, we're essentially adding to-dos only when we call the click listener on the add button. But of course, we might have to-dos in the database already when we start the application. So if we already had to-dos there, so we'll at the end of the constructor, we'll call refresh to-dos to kind of initialize the UI with everything that is in the database from before. Again, we'll press build here, which is Command F9, or if you have a touch bar Mac, then it's the little hammer icon on the touch bar. And now it's the moment of truth. So if I didn't typo anything too bad, this should work. So important stuff, do webinar. I'll click here. You can see we have a to-do webinar. Other stuff, let's add that. Let's check this off and let's refresh. Make sure that things persisted so we can see we can change something here. Refresh. Oh, yeah. So you can see that those get persisted. The reason it didn't get persisted here is that our logic isn't very solid here, so it will actually save when the field gets blurred. That's when the change happens. We can go in and change how often or eagerly the values from text fields get persisted or committed, but that's a different webinar. All right, so we have a pretty functional to-do application already, saving things to the database. It's pulling things from the database. So we have kind of most of the CRUD operations except for the D part. So we don't have the delete part. So we might actually go in and add a button for clearing out all the already completed ones. So again,
Does
let's
it
go.
make sense to pause for a little bit for some of the relevant questions for right now, or do you want to save them all to the end?
No, if you have any relevant questions, now is probably a
Yeah,
good step. Now we're going to go into the kind of enhancing and a
right.
working application stage of the part.
So we've got a lot of great questions. Some are more general. I'm going to leave the general ones for the end because I think that might lead to a larger exploration, but specifically around the code. For
Yep.
example, there's a question here. How does the change listener know about the ID of the to-do to update?
I believe we're talking about
Yes.
this listener here. So when we call set bean here, we pass in the to do that we passed into the constructor here, and we're passing it in right here. So for each to do that we have in the database, we map each of those to one to do layout, and the listener here gets triggered whenever one of these fields change. And since we call get bean, we have the same instance as we had over here. So we're updating the same object that we got from the database. So the object itself contains the ID.
When an item is being added, does the entire page reload, or can we do this asynchronous?
So Vaadin is built for creating single page applications. That means that every change that we do only results in that part of the actual page getting updated asynchronously. So under the hood, what happens is that if, for instance, when we add a new one, only this little part of the UI gets updated. Kind of the way this works is that the Java code that we have here runs on the JVM. That's why we're able to, for instance, have access to our repository directly from our UI code. And what runs in the browser is a small client engine that speaks to the server. So the server will essentially, when we, for instance, add a new button, it will send over an instruction saying like, hey, we need a new composition, a horizontal layout that contains a checkbox and a text field with these values. And then the actual DOM gets created here. So if we look at what's being created in the browser, you can see that this is, let me see if I can bump this up so people can actually see what's happening. You can see that there's like a one-to-one mapping between what we have in the Java code. So we have a Vaadin vertical layout, which is the main code. We have an H1 there for the header. We have the horizontal layout that contains a text field and a button. And then we have these horizontal layouts representing those compositions, the to-do layouts that we created. So Vaadin takes care of generating the DOM. It does that asynchronously and only updating the parts of the UI that needs to be updated. So it's a very quick and smooth operation and gives a just very responsive end result.
And that's good because you've just answered about two other questions. One was around, is Vaadin SVA ready? Pages generated the server side or the client side? I mean, I guess maybe you could talk about that a bit more later if people have got more detailed questions. And also the other question,
Sure.
how does vertical layout and horizontal layout translate to HTML, CSS? So I think you've covered that too.
So essentially, yeah, horizontal layout and vertical layout, yeah, you could see that they translated to these custom HTML elements. All the components that we have are standards-based web components, meaning that we've essentially shipped a custom library of new HTML tags that you can use anywhere. If we go one step further, essentially a horizontal and a vertical layout just essentially are helpers for Flexbox and CSS. So they essentially just give you a convenient way from Java to deal with that. We could get into ways you could, like if you want to work on a lower level abstraction, you could, instead of using, say, a horizontal layout, we could create a new div, for instance, if you just wanted to have a plain div and set the CSS yourself, or you could use a flex layout, which is a more generic flex layout where you kind of specify the direction and the grow and shrink ratios and stuff yourself. So these are really just kind of convenience wrappers around Flexbox.
Okay, there's a couple more specific questions for this demo, and then I think it'll be a good time to move on to the next step.
Yep.
It says here, is there also a binder for the to-dos list, so not all items need to be re-rendered? For example, if this is a big list, would it be better to just apply just the changes? I assume that's about removing all of the items and then re-adding them all.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree. Like this is a live coding type of thing to do. This is very clear for kind of explaining what happens. If you had a really big list of things, most likely I would use our data grid component, which does a very good job of efficiently rendering things. There's also something called a repeater, which essentially works a little bit like a binder in that you pass in a list of things and what components those should map to. And then based on which ones have actually changed, it would only go in and update those. So this, I realize, is not a very kind of performant way of doing it, but it's in this demo, I'm opting more for kind of clarity in code than for kind of actual performance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. As a live demo person, I completely know what you mean. One last question before we move on to the removing section. So what happens with binder on to-do layout? What happens to the binder on to-do layout on remove?
So when we remove one of these, I guess we haven't gotten to that yet, but
that might be a good segue to removing.
Yeah, well, essentially, since this binder here, it's scoped within this to-do layout. So when we get rid of this to-do layout, we don't have any more references to this. We don't have we've severed that from our heap, essentially making it eligible for garbage collection, and that will get taken care of. So we don't have to worry about that anymore at that point.
Okay, yeah, feel free to carry on.
All right, so yeah, I only have a couple more small things I want to do. Want to add the clear button, and then we're going to take a look at theming in Vaadin. So essentially, how can we change the look and feel a little bit to make this look even a little bit nicer than it does? So let's create a new button here, first of all, for clear completed, like this, clear button. Let's see if I can type, move it up here, and then we'll add it underneath the to-dos list. So we'll add the clear button, and for this, we'll add, again, a click listener, the same as we did for the add button. But instead of calling save here, we'll need to do something else. So we'll go to the repo, and then I'm going to create a new method here. So I'm going to call, again, the same way as I did for the refresh to-dos. I like to kind of call a method as if it exists and then use the IDE to generate it. So delete by done, and then we'll pass in true. So we want to have a method that deletes any to-do by the done field being true. Now this is a convention in Spring Data. So if we have a method signature that follows this keyword, delete by, and then field name, and passing in the value there, we can actually have, again, Spring Data actually generate the SQL code and everything for us. The only thing we need to do here, it's another cool one, start new line. Very simple. You don't have to make sure that you're at the end of the line when you hit enter. Just hold down shift wherever and get a new line. But what we need to make sure that we do here is mark this as a transactional. So Spring Data doesn't want to delete anything if it's not inside of a transaction. So we need to do that. So again, we've deleted, and then we'll call this refresh to-dos that we determined already. That is not the most efficient way of doing things, but in this case, again, since I changed the repo code, notice that we need to refresh this to actually make that work. Should be a pretty quick refresh here, and once we get this up and running, we can make sure that that actually works. So let's run this. We see we have a new button here. and then we'll do 1, 2, and let's mark 1 as complete, and click clear completed. So you see that that disappeared. So that's, again, by just naming a method the right way, Spring Data took care of most of the heavy lifting for us there. Very nice. I want to spend the last 5 minutes of the live demo here cleaning this up a little bit. So I want to mark the buttons a little bit clearer. So I want to make this a primary button. I want to mark this as a slightly dangerous button. I'll add a keyboard shortcut for enter here so that we can add a lot of stuff very easily. So the way we do that is we'll add a theme variant. So we'll add a primary theme variant to this, and we'll add click shortcut here to enter. This I love. So I never remember what the actual enum is for that holds these, but just typing the actual key inside of the enumeration will get the right autocomplete here anyway, since IntelliJ knows kind of what the expected range of values is there. So that makes it a whole lot easier for me. Same for clear button. We'll add a theme variant, button variant, use the air variant there. Build this, and let's see how that looks. Sometimes you'll notice that you get this. This is due to a timing issue with Spring Boot DevTools that we have an open ticket for. Usually just rebuilding the project will sort that thing out. So just kind of good thing to know. So now you see we have a blue button here, kind of indicating that's primary. We can hit enter to add things here, and you can see the clear button is a little bit kind of highlighted in red, so people know that's like something bad might happen. We're gonna do something irreversible when we're doing that. Finally, I want to show how we can change to a dark theme. So I'm using the dark theme here in my IDE. Why not use that in the application that we built? The theme that we have in Vaadin is called Lumo class, and it has 2 variants. So we can specify this variant that we want, dark in this case, which is fun because Lumo is essentially means light in Finnish. So we're doing light.dark. I guess that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but it is what it is. Let's build that again. Seems like this is happening more than when I have the webinar software running. Now you can see we have kind of all the colors are in a dark scheme here, and we can go in and change things, or we can kind of notice that everything fits in here. So we can do shady stuff. And there we have it. I think that's about as far as I want to take this demo right now. So we leave some space or time for questions and answers, but I hope you're able to kind of get a good sense of what Vaadin is. It's a full stack framework that allows us to build web applications, more specifically single page dynamic applications, fully in Java. What we didn't have to do here is kind of write the HTML or JavaScript. We didn't have to define REST endpoints that we call, or how we serialize different types of data and stuff. All of that's kind of taken care of by the framework itself. If you want to go deeper into this, I would suggest that you go to the Vaadin website, to our learning center here. I just recently, earlier this spring, created a new tutorial series that goes really in depth with Spring Boot and Vaadin. And here we're building a CRM application complete with a Spring security login and Spring Data. We're going from scratch all the way to deploying this to AWS and making this an installable progressive web app and all of that. So yeah, that's it. Go ahead and check this out if you want. And Trisha, I'm sure we're ready to kind of jump over to questions. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen?
I don't really need to. My next slide is literally, do you have any questions? So, and you
Okay,
might need
yeah.
to show some stuff on your screen. So one of the
Okay.
main questions is, can I get the source code for this demo?
Yes. So for that, let's say I'll upload that to GitHub and share it on my Twitter. Is that okay? And of course, you can add it to the email that goes out later.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I also found that when I was looking at the Vaadin tutorials, the quick start tutorial is a to-do list. So I guess if people are working through that, they get something similar.
They'll get something similar that's a little bit narrower in scope, that we don't do a database, and kind of it skips some parts just in order to make it a little bit shorter. But I'll share this code just so if anyone is looking at this video later on, find it on YouTube, and they want to go in and continue from exactly where we left off, that's something they can do.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can when we put it on YouTube, I'll put the link that you send me, I'll put it on the YouTube description as well.
Yeah.
We have a lot of questions. This is great. This means there's a lot of people very interested in what you said. It's difficult to organize these questions by category, so we might jump around a bit. One of the questions which appeals to me is, no need for writing JavaScript anymore?
I would say yes, there's no need if you don't want to. So we've made it possible for you to build applications completely on this level of abstraction, but understanding that there are cases where you might want to do something that's kind of more kind of closer to bare metal. So for instance, let's do an example here. So let's take our add button here. We'll call get element. This will give us the kind of a representation of the underlying DOM element. You can see we can set and remove attributes and properties, but we can also add event listeners. So we can add JavaScript event listeners here. So if I put like mouse over, and then let's listen for a mouse over event on this, and whenever that happens, we'll take the to-dos list add new. Let's do a paragraph tag with mouse over like this. Let's build that. So this kind of means that you have always the option of kind of drilling through the layer of abstraction if you need to actually do something on a more DOM level. So yeah, you can see whenever we mouse over now, we get the text here. Equally, it's easy to kind of integrate to existing JavaScript libraries or stuff if you need to kind of interact with those. But the idea is that for the kind of 95, 98% of the stuff that you do, you probably don't need to touch any JavaScript. For the most kind of applications we see our customers do, they don't tend to have any JavaScript in their application.
I think this is probably fairly related. It says, how do you do advanced front-end stuff with Vaadin? It looks great on a simple example. I think there's probably a couple of different things here. One, you said there are more advanced elements, so you'll end up, I guess, with the ability to create more advanced UIs. But also, you've also said that you can hook into JavaScript, you can hook into lower level stuff if you want to do something a bit more complicated.
Yeah, so we have a really large set of these components, anywhere from date pickers to data grids and charts and uploads and selects, and like you name it, we probably have it. So we have a really kind of complete set of these components, and really the power in a component-based framework lies in this. So you kind of make compositions of existing components and you give them your own API within your application. So you have kind of meaningful reusable components that you can use, kind of share with your team and with other people working on the project that are more specific and more complex in that sense. So I've seen just incredibly complex applications being built with this. One of the kind of advantages of this architecture that we have is that the JavaScript payload, what kind of runs in the browser, doesn't grow with the kind of with the amount of code or views that you have. So we've seen applications that have literally several hundreds of very complex form views, like essentially running entire governments on this, and that's going to be just as fast and performant as having a single to-do application like this. So I think that's pretty neat.
There were a couple of other questions around, I think there's a lot of questions around like how the Java gets translated to the browser. So one question was around, is Vaadin based on GWT? Another was based on how can you use Java FX instead? Does Vaadin support building UI using pure Java FX? And a bunch of other stuff there. So you've covered a little bit about how the UI works, but I don't know if you can perhaps give an overview which answers those questions.
Yeah, I'll try to answer those. So so the way this kind of works on a more theoretical level is that any component, in our case, the view or the button, kind of has a state. So it knows kind of what its state is, like the view here knows what components are its children and so on. And that state, whenever something kind of changes here, a small kind of, how do I put this? A small kind of description of that state will get sent over to the browser, which then uses, or a small instruction that gets then used to generate the web components here. So we don't generate the actual HTML here. Instead, we generate a small instruction, essentially a very kind of terse piece of JSON saying like, hey browser, I need you to create a vertical layout with these components, and then this will actually go ahead and create those. As to using GWT, the framework used to use GWT for all the widgets up until version 8. We implemented the entire set of components as of Vaadin 10 using the new web component standard. So they're an entirely new set of components. So there isn't any kind of UI code that you would be touching that's based on GWT. We still use GWT for some of the kind of internal plumbing, where kind of passing data back and forth and kind of internals into how the framework works. But as a developer, it's not something you are exposed to. As for Java FX, this would be an alternative to using Java FX. It's not something that's very easy for you to kind of combine with Java FX.
And then going to the other side, to the back end, there's a lot of questions around how do I integrate it with things like Spring Security? How much Spring Boot do I need to know to be able to use Vaadin? Like, I think it's all about the relationship between Vaadin and Spring Boot, or Spring.
Yeah. Yeah, so both are entirely kind of independent here. They just happen to work really well together. So if just kind of want to make clear that if you are kind of more, say, you like Jakarta, you want to use CDI instead of Spring for doing dependency injection, that's completely fine. That's something that we support equally well. In this case, I just personally tend to have a preference for using Spring, and something that works really well, I feel, for both demos and for production applications. So that's why I kind of like to promote this combination. I guess the amount of Spring Boot you need to know, or Spring in general, is the amount of Spring you need to know to be able to build the backend that you have in mind. So depending on how complex that is, you might need to go more into dealing with, I don't know, transactions, security, like you mentioned, maybe calling external services if you need to integrate with other kind of services on your backend and so on. We have examples on the website on integrating with Spring Security. For instance, that tutorial series that I showed you will walk you through how to integrate with Spring Security for logging in and so on.
We have so many questions. We don't have a lot of time to cover them. I think an interesting question is Vaadin free for use for a personal project?
Yeah, Vaadin is Apache 2 licensed open source, so it's free to use for personal projects and for commercial projects and for pretty much any projects. We do have a couple of like additional component sets or tools that are kind of part of a subscription, but you can build essentially any Vaadin application. Certainly everything that we've done here today is part of the free and open source model that you can use for any personal or commercial use that you want.
Someone was asking, what's the default server that's embedded? Is it Jetty or something else?
The default in Spring Boot is Tomcat. Yeah, you can see it's Tomcat getting started here. You can change that, but I've been happy with this.
There are so many questions here, you can't possibly answer them all. I think what I might do is I might send you all the questions. What I often do with the webinar is I'll send the presenter, all the leftover questions, and you can give me the answers and we'll put them together in a blog post, because that way it's a bit easier to kind of clump together the relevant ones. And also a lot of these are kind of bigger, like how do I integrate with, how do I create one of these? And so with that one, we can, with the blog post, we can link to relevant examples and things like that.
Exactly, and it'll be easier for people to find also in the future if they're kind of need to figure out how to work that.
Exactly. So I think that'd be good. I do have I feel pain in the way you were doing extract variable and then moving up your fields. So I have to finish with is there a problem with doing extract field instead of extract variable?
Well, so the thing is, if I create a new button,
yeah, you can't do it at the field level. It won't let you do that, right?
So,
yes.
So it would do it like this, or then if I go up here and create new button, I mean, it doesn't work the same way. Yeah, I would have to go in and do button.
But if you were doing it, you're doing it as a variable anyway, so you're doing it inside, well, I don't know. Anyway, yes, actually, I do feel your pain there. So, because I do the same thing, I want to create the right-hand side of the expression, and then I usually either type VAR for postfix completion or I extract variable. And yeah, it doesn't work at the field level. Maybe we'll raise a ticket for that.
All right.
Great. Well, yeah, we are out of time. So I want to thank you so much for doing this presentation. I learned loads. I love this because I've done a lot of web development in the past, and I'm always looking for some nice, easy, Java-y, lightweight way of doing web development. And this looks like it's a really good way of, especially when you combine it with something like Spring Boot, getting that Java UI in a web front end. And I think that's really good. Cool. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a lot of fun.
It was great, and it's really great to have someone on who really knows IntelliJ IDEA and uses it in the way that you're supposed to use it while you're coding, because that's a really good way to learn how to use the tools. And I learned a trick, because I think I told you this when you gave me your demo, where you dropped the POM file on the icon and it opens up the project. I was like, whoa, I didn't know you could do that. And thank you everyone for all of your questions. You've got absolutely fantastic questions here. So I will send them to Marcus. Marcus will give me the answers and a bunch of links. When the video is available, I usually try and get a blog post out soon after the video is available. So we'll embed the video, we'll put the answers to the questions, and we'll email everyone who is registered with the video and the link to the blog post when it's available. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Thank you.